Another day, another problem for Washington. And once again, another reminder that decisions made in the United States almost never stay contained within its borders. History keeps proving the same uncomfortable lesson. Removing a leader does not remove the forces that put him there in the first place. And this week, as the Venezuela operation moved deeper into its early phase, something unexpected started happening in global oil markets. Something that perfectly explains why economic pressure campaigns so often backfire instead of delivering control. On paper, the strategy looked straightforward. Pressure Venezuela hard enough, disrupt its exports, and cut off access to cheap oil. And at first glance, it seemed to work. Chinese refiners stopped buying Venezuelan crude, exactly as Washington hoped. But here's the part most headlines missed. They did not stop buying sanctioned oil. They simply changed who they were buying it from. Venezuela was out, Iran was in, same product, same discounts, different flag on the tanker. This is the core misunderstanding behind sanctions-based strategies. Capital does not care about ideology, speeches, or political narratives. Capital cares about margins. If one supply chain becomes risky or unreliable, the market does not stop. It reroutes. When Venezuelan shipments slowed, Chinese buyers did not panic. They adjusted. They replaced one sanctioned supplier with another and did it faster than policymakers anticipated. What we are watching is not a political story. It is a market story. Pressure applied to Caracas did not eliminate demand. It did not change refinery economics. It simply redirected cash flows. Oil that once generated revenue for Venezuela now generates revenue for Tehran. The trade never stopped. Only the destination of the money changed. And that is why this story matters far beyond Venezuela. This is not about one country or one operation. It is about whether economic power can still reshape global markets, or whether markets now adapt faster than governments can control them. Because if pressure on one producer simply strengthens another sanctioned producer, then the entire logic of economic warfare starts to collapse. To understand why this shift happened so smoothly, we need to look at who is actually buying this oil. In China, independent refiners, often called teapots, play a crucial role in absorbing sanctioned crude. These companies operate on razor-thin margins. They survive by buying the cheapest barrels available and turning them into usable products. For years, Venezuelan heavy crude fit that need perfectly. It was deeply discounted, reliable enough, and ideal for their refining setups. According to shipping and tracking data, China was importing hundreds of thousands of barrels per day of Venezuelan oil before the blockade tightened. That volume was never massive relative to total Chinese imports, but it was strategically important. Venezuelan heavy crude is especially valuable because of its refining characteristics. It produces large amounts of asphalt and heavy outputs that are critical for infrastructure projects across China. Then the pressure increased. Tanker seizures became more frequent, loading slowed, routes became riskier. And once Venezuelan ports effectively stopped sending cargoes toward Asia, Chinese refiners faced a simple business decision. They could either bid up prices for non-sanctioned oil and crush their margins, or they could switch suppliers while keeping costs under control. They chose the option every rational market actor would choose. They switched. Iranian heavy crude offered nearly identical characteristics at nearly identical discounts. Same quality range, same price gap versus Brent, different geopolitical label. From a refinery balance sheet perspective, the decision required no ideology, no loyalty, no hesitation. It was pure arithmetic. This is where the sanctions paradox becomes impossible to ignore. The United States did not stop the flow of discounted oil into China. It only changed which sanctioned country benefited from it. Venezuelan barrels disappeared from the ledger. Iranian barrels replaced them almost line by line. The market did not resist pressure. It absorbed it and moved on. Now here is where the consequences start to matter strategically. When sanctions on Venezuela were briefly eased in the recent past, something revealing happened. Venezuelan crude became more expensive. The discount narrowed. That made it less attractive to buyers who depend on extreme price advantages to survive. At the same time, Iranian oil remained fully sanctioned and therefore deeply discounted. The economics quietly flipped. So when pressure on Venezuela intensified again, Chinese buyers did not see a tougher market. They saw a clearer one. Venezuelan oil carried higher operational risk with no pricing advantage. Iranian oil carried sanctions risk, but flowed more consistently at the same discount. From a market perspective, the choice was obvious. Sanctions meant to punish one country effectively subsidized another. This is not theory. It is accounting. As Iranian oil volumes increased, so did Iranian revenue. And oil revenue in Iran does not stay isolated inside civilian budgets. It feeds state power, it funds logistics, military capabilities, and regional influence. Every additional barrel sold strengthens the same structures that Washington claims it wants to weaken. That creates a deeply uncomfortable feedback loop. The United States applies pressure in one theater, only to increase financial capacity in another. More Iranian oil revenue translates into more resources for regional operations. drone production, missile programs, and proxy networks. Meanwhile, American forces spend additional money intercepting threats that are indirectly funded by the very trade this policy redirected. This is the strategic contradiction at the heart of modern sanctions. The policy does not eliminate adversaries from the market. It reorganizes them. And in this case, the reorganization favored one of the most hostile players in the global system. The goal was leverage. The result was redistribution. This is why Washington could not simply walk away from Venezuela. At that point, the operation stopped being about oil volumes or one government. It became a test case, a test of whether sanctions still work as a tool of power. If pressure on Venezuela failed, if the government survived, if oil kept flowing through alternative routes, then the credibility of economic coercion itself would be damaged. Because once that credibility cracks, the lesson spreads fast. Iran learns it, Russia learns it, China learns it. Even smaller countries learn it. If you resist long enough, if you adapt your trade routes, if you build parallel systems, American pressure eventually loses its bite. Venezuela became the example Washington could not afford to lose. That explains the escalation: more tanker seizures, more naval presence, more confrontations at sea. Enforcement shifted from financial restrictions to physical intervention. Sanctions stopped being paperwork and started becoming patrols, and every interception carried the risk of miscalculation, escalation, or direct confrontation with other major powers. At the same time the market kept adjusting, oil did not disappear, demand did not vanish, buyers rerouted, sellers adapted. The system proved more flexible than the policy designed to constrain it. While political leaders focused on control, traders focused on continuity. And continuity always finds a way. This is the deeper problem. Sanctions moved money, not power. They reshuffled cash flows without reshaping incentives. And as long as global demand for cheap, heavy crude exists, someone will supply it. If not Venezuela, then Iran. If not Iran, then Russia. Pressure did not reduce dependence. It merely changed the invoice. Another expectation quietly collapsed as the operation unfolded. American oil companies did not rush into Venezuela. Political speeches suggested that once the government changed, major firms would invest billions, restore infrastructure, and rapidly bring production back online. But corporations do not move on rhetoric. They move on certainty. Venezuela offered none. A fractured political transition, unresolved legal ownership, unclear contract enforcement, and the constant risk of sanctions snapping back made large-scale investment irrational. No executive signs off on multi-billion-dollar projects in an environment where the rules can change overnight. Energy companies require guarantees long before drilling begins. They need legal protection against future policy shifts, stable regulatory frameworks, insurance coverage for assets and personnel, and access to international financing. None of these conditions existed. Banks were unwilling to lend. Insurers refused coverage. Legal structures remained undefined. Even firms interested in Venezuelan reserves understood that entering too early meant absorbing enormous risk with no assurance of return. Governments can announce plans instantly. Corporations wait years. As a result, Venezuelan production remained disrupted. Wells were not restored. Infrastructure stayed degraded. Export capacity failed to recover its scale, and this production gap mattered far more than political control. Because as long as Venezuelan output stayed offline, Chinese demand for heavy crude did not disappear. It simply searched for stability elsewhere, and Iran was ready to supply it. This highlights a crucial misunderstanding in modern economic strategy. Removing a government does not automatically activate private capital. Markets are not patriotic. They are cautious. They do not reward ambition. They reward predictability. Until Venezuela offers enforceable contracts, political continuity, and credible legal protection, investment will remain frozen. And every month that delay continues, alternative suppliers strengthen their position. So while political leaders debated control, the market made its own decision. Venezuela remained unstable, Iranian oil remained available, and Chinese refiners continued operating without disruption. The gap between political intent and market reality widened. Power changed hands in Caracas, but supply chains followed a different logic entirely. While private investment stalled, enforcement moved in the opposite direction. Sanctions stopped being mostly financial and started becoming physical. Tanker seizures increased, naval patrols expanded. Shipping routes, once considered routine, became contested zones. This shift matters because it fundamentally changes the nature of economic pressure. What was once handled through banks, contracts, and compliance offices now requires ships, surveillance, and military coordination. And once trade enforcement becomes militarized, every interaction carries escalation risk. Shipping insurance markets reacted immediately. When tankers face seizure or interception, insurers raise premiums or withdraw coverage entirely. That cost does not disappear. It gets passed down the chain. Refiners pay more, traders adjust pricing, end users absorb higher volatility. Even when oil keeps flowing, the friction increases. Markets can adapt to sanctions, but they price risk aggressively when force enters the equation. This is where economic pressure quietly transforms into strategic instability. Each interception creates uncertainty. Each escort signals confrontation. Each disputed seizure raises the probability of miscalculation. Trade becomes a chessboard instead of a spreadsheet. And while none of these incidents individually cause a crisis, together they normalize a higher level of global tension around energy flows. At the same time, alternative networks strengthen, dark fleets expand, payment systems shift toward barter, local currencies, and commodity swaps. Transparency declines, oversight weakens. Ironically, the effort to control trade often makes it harder to monitor. Sanctions push activity into shadows where data becomes incomplete and leverage declines. The result is a global energy system that still functions, but at higher cost, higher risk, and lower visibility. Oil moves, money moves. But trust erodes, and once trust erodes, every future intervention becomes more expensive, more complex, and less predictable. That is the hidden price of turning economic tools into instruments of force. As enforcement intensified at sea, the diplomatic response across Latin America began to harden. Several governments in the region made it clear that the operation was no longer viewed as a localized issue. It was seen as a precedent. Colombia mobilized forces along its border. Leaders across South America framed the intervention as a threat to regional sovereignty rather than a security measure. This shift matters because it signals a broader resistance to unilateral economic and military actions. A coordinated response emerged. Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Uruguay, and Spain issued joint statements rather than isolated objections. That detail is important. Joint messaging reflects shared concern, not symbolic disagreement. The message was consistent. Regional stability requires regional consensus. External pressure without coordination creates long-term instability. Even governments traditionally aligned with Washington avoided enthusiastic support. This does not reverse the operation, but it reshapes the strategic environment. Every future intervention now faces higher diplomatic friction. Neutrality is no longer automatic. Support is conditional. Latin America is not choosing between the United States and China. It is choosing autonomy. And autonomy means fewer guarantees that economic pressure campaigns will receive regional backing. Europe reacted differently. Concerns were expressed, warnings were issued, but actions remained limited. European governments emphasized international law while avoiding direct confrontation. Dependence on American security infrastructure constrained their response. Support was cautious, measured, and deliberately vague. This quiet hesitation speaks volumes. At the international level, the pattern repeated. Condemnations carried no enforcement, institutions lacked leverage, power moved faster than law, and other countries took note. The lesson was clear. Rules apply unevenly, and once that perception spreads, compliance becomes optional rather than assumed. Now let us bring this back to the domestic economic impact. On the surface, nothing dramatic seems to have changed inside the United States. Energy prices did not spike overnight. Financial markets did not collapse. Daily life continued as usual. But strategic costs rarely appear immediately. They accumulate quietly. Every naval deployment, every extended patrol, every enforcement operation carries a financial burden that must be funded over time. Shipping costs are one of the first pressure points. When energy routes become contested, insurance premiums rise. Freight rates increase. Traders price in uncertainty. Those added costs ripple outward. They affect manufacturers, logistics companies, and ultimately consumers. The effect is not a sudden shock, but persistent volatility that makes planning harder across the economy. There's also the issue of market predictability. Stable energy markets support stable growth. Volatile markets discourage long-term investment. When price signals become distorted by geopolitical risk, capital hesitates. Businesses delay decisions. Expansion slows. The economy absorbs friction that never appears in official statements, but shows up in reduced efficiency. Then there is the currency dimension. Each time countries observe how dollar-based systems are weaponized, incentives shift. Alternatives gain appeal. Settlements move toward local currencies, barter, and commodity exchanges. The impact on dollar demand is gradual, but erosion compounds over time. Dollar dominance lowers borrowing costs and sustains fiscal flexibility. Weakening that advantage raises future costs. These dynamics connect foreign policy to domestic outcomes. Higher financing costs, reduced fiscal space, fewer options during crises. Strategic overreach abroad often translates into economic constraint at home. The connection is indirect, but it is real, and it becomes visible only after years, when adjustments are no longer reversible. So what did the Venezuela operation actually deliver when measured against its stated goals? On paper, there were clear tactical outcomes. Maduro was removed from power. The government in Caracas entered a transition phase. Enforcement actions disrupted some shipments. These are measurable events. But strategy is not judged by events alone. It is judged by outcomes. The core objective was never just political change. It was control over energy flows and market leverage. On that front, the results were far less convincing. Oil continued to move. China continued to buy discounted crude. The only meaningful difference was the supplier. Venezuelan barrels vanished. Iranian barrels replaced them. Revenue streams shifted eastward. The market adapted faster than policy could respond, and adaptation neutralized leverage. Meanwhile, unintended consequences accumulated. Iran gained market share and income. Russia expanded its role in maritime escorts. Trade enforcement became militarized. Diplomatic resistance increased across Latin America. American oil companies stayed on the sidelines. The blockade leaked. Sanctions lost signaling power. None of these outcomes aligned with the original promise of restored control. This is the defining mismatch. The operation succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. Removing a government did not reshape incentives. Disrupting one supplier did not reduce demand. Markets do not obey narratives. They respond to price, risk, and continuity. And in this case, continuity won. When power focuses on symbols rather than systems, results become fragile. Control over territory does not equal control over trade. Influence over governments does not guarantee influence over capital. An economic warfare that ignores adaptability often strengthens the very networks it aims to dismantle. That is the uncomfortable conclusion. The system adjusted, the map was redrawn, and the costs of that redraw will continue to surface long after the headlines fade. This episode was never just about Venezuela. It was the opening chapter of a much larger shift, a shift in how power operates inside a global system that no longer responds the way it once did. The assumption behind sanctions was simple. Apply enough pressure and markets will comply. What this operation revealed instead is that markets adapt faster than enforcement mechanisms can adjust. When one door closes, capital looks for the next open one. Sanctions were designed for a world with fewer nodes and slower feedback loops. Today, supply chains are distributed, payments are flexible, and logistics networks are creative. When one producer is isolated, buyers do not disappear. They reroute. When one currency becomes risky, alternatives emerge. The system absorbs shocks and continues moving. Power removes leaders, markets rewrite routes. That is why this matters going forward. Iran exports more oil. China diversifies supply. Russia refines enforcement evasion. Payment systems fragment. Dollar-based leverage weakens incrementally. None of this happens overnight. But over time, these adjustments reshape the balance of power. Economic unipolarity fades not through confrontation, but through adaptation. The uncomfortable reality is that economic pressure now has diminishing returns. It still creates friction, but it no longer guarantees control. And when pressure strengthens parallel systems instead of dismantling them, the long-term cost outweighs the short-term optics. What looks decisive in headlines often proves counterproductive in balance sheets. Venezuela was a test. The test exposed limits. Limits of sanctions, limits of coercion, limits of assuming markets will obey political intent. The operation continues, but the lesson is already clear. In a system this interconnected, control is temporary, adaptation is permanent, and the future of global finance will be shaped less by force and more by how quickly capital learns to move around it. And if this message touched your heart in any way, help me share it with more people. Let's do this together and break the goal of 10,000 likes on this video. I promise you this. Wherever I am, I will be genuinely grateful for that simple gesture. And I truly believe it comes back to you in the form of blessings, many blessings in your life. With that in mind, I am sure you are going to love the next video. So subscribe to the channel right now, turn on notifications, and do not miss what is coming next. I will be waiting for you there. It is full of discoveries like this one, and I can guarantee that in just a few seconds, you might come across insights that completely transform the way you live. Before we close, I really want to hear from you in the comments. What did you feel while listening to all of this? How have you been searching for your inner peace lately? Your voice truly matters to me, and I am genuinely looking forward to reading your reflections. Let us continue this journey of self-discovery together. This is only the beginning. See you very soon. Until then,